When you're looking at validity and reliability, you need to make sure that you know the wording of the specification, which if you're one of my students, you will know I bang on about this until the cows come home. So all the questions are written from the wording of the specification. So you need to know what's on the spec and what it means. So on here you can see for reliability, it talks about reliability across all methods of investigation. And that means that all research methods like experiments, correlations, observations, self-report, that all of them, you know about reliability across those different methods. You need to know ways of assessing reliability, and there are only two ways mentioned on this specification, which are test, retest and inter-observer. And you also know how to improve the reliability of investigations. Regarding validity, it specifically mentions face validity, concurrent, ecological and temporal, so you must know those. It talks about assessment of validity and improving validity. So those are, the assessment and improving are new for you probably this year. So we'll start with validity. What is it? You should pause the video and tell the person next to you or tell yourself what validity is. And validity means, does the research tool measure what it's meant to measure? So if it was an experiment, does the dependent variable actually measure what it's meant to measure? If it's an observation, do the behavioural categories really measure what you're looking for in this observation? So if your observation was investigating antisocial behaviour in a playground, do the behavioural categories actually measure different types of antisocial behaviour? So we're looking at whatever research tool you're using, does it measure what it's meant to measure? And if it does, then it's a valid measure. Internal validity. Now, internal validity isn't mentioned on the spec, but you're expected to know what it is. And whenever I talk about internal validity, I get you to ask two questions to yourself. Is it well controlled? And is it well designed? Is that investigation well controlled and well designed? Because if it is well controlled and well designed, then it's likely that you are measuring what you intend to measure. Were there other factors that came into play that could have affected the DV other than the IV? Remember, we want to know, does in an experiment, for example, does the independent variable cause the effect on the dependent variable? Sometimes there might be nuisance variables or variables that systematically change with the IV that are affecting the DV. And you will know these to be called extraneous variables and confounding variables if they systematically change with the IV and end up in the experiment. So if you've got variables that are in there that shouldn't be in there, then you don't have internal validity. So internal validity is looking at the control and the design of the investigation. In experiments, it's making sure that it is the IV affecting the DV. External validity, I'm sure you know, it's the extent to which the findings can be applied beyond the research. So can you generalize the results to everyday life? And so when you're looking at an investigation, it might have fantastic internal validity. It might be really well controlled. It might be really well designed. However, the task might be artificial, or the setting might be artificial, or the sample might not be representative. And so therefore, the actual findings could be valid, but don't necessarily apply to the outside world. So what I want you to do is just pause the video and list the 4 types of external validity that you learnt during your first year or your AS studies. And you should have identified in your first year that you looked at ecological validity, temporal validity, population validity and mundane realism, because all of those things can be a threat to validity. So we'll just look at what they are. So ecological validity refers to the setting. I always think about ecology is the study of the environment. So ecological validity is referring to the environment that you do the investigation. So if you do a laboratory experiment, then that might be a really fake setting. And so people have come to the laboratory expecting to be involved in an investigation, and they might start showing demand characteristics where they've guessed the purpose of the study because they know that they're in an investigation. And so if the if the environment is really fake, then that might affect how far you can generalize the results to the outside world. So I've put a picture there of the strange situation, which you should know is an observation, a controlled observation that was done to assess the different attachment types, which you learned about in the first year. And so when you look at the strange situation, it was designed to be a difficult, a challenging situation for children aged 9 months to 18 months. But it is, although it's a challenging situation, maybe that fake environment of going to a brand new place might lack ecological validity, and you might see results that are not necessarily true. Because if you've done the task, if you put babies in a more challenging situation but in an everyday one, then maybe you'd see different results. Any laboratory experiment or investigation you can think of will be low in ecological validity. So if you think about Milgram's experiment for testing obedience to legitimate authority, or Ash's experiment where they tested conformity to the majority, or Moscovici's experiment where they tested conformity to the minority, any of those from social influence, or loads from memory. So Loftus's research on how misleading information affects eyewitness testimony, where participants went in and looked at videos of car crashes. They were in a laboratory setting. So the electric shock task of Milgram in a laboratory setting, apparently a lot of people guessed the shocks weren't real. In Ash's experiment for majority, a lot of people said that the Confederates might not have been convincing because they're all actors. So, and Loftus's study, where they looked at videos of car accidents, it's very, very different watching a video of a car accident to being on a road where you see cars actually hit each other. So the nature of it, where it is, could actually impact on the results. Temporal validity refers to whether the findings hold true over time. So we're looking at, I've got loads of different time zones there: 2002, 1976, very good year, 1897, 1950, 1985. It's not the year itself that is the problem, it's whether there have been changes in society that could impact on the findings that might be the problem. So I've got 1897 on there because Jacob's digit span, which tested the capacity of short-term memory, was first carried out in the 1890s, and the capacity of short-term memory was the same back then as it is today. So that study doesn't lack temporal validity. However, when you think about Ash's study, which was done in 1950s America, what was going on politically at that time with McCarthyism? So the political figure Joseph McCarthy, who went around accusing everybody of being communist, it was such a kind of frightening time where people didn't want to stand out, people didn't want to look different, people wanted to fit in. And so 1950s America is seen as a kind of more conformist society. So because Ash's study was looking at conformity to the majority, we call that particular study a child of its time, because since then there have been, changes in society, and people aren't scared of being accused of being a communist, not in the same way they were in the 50s at least. And so we might see different results. I often think about laws that change. So in the UK, the law on homosexuality changed in 1967. Before then, you could be arrested for being a gay man, not for being a gay woman, because apparently they didn't exist. Ha ha ha. But if you were a gay man, you could be arrested. So if someone did an investigation into sexual attraction before the 1960s, and they were speaking to people that couldn't freely talk about their sexuality, then they might get very different results. They get people who were lying because they'd be frightened to say their real sexual preference or attraction in case they were incriminating themselves. And so a study that was done pre-1967 on that would not be temporally valid today, because thankfully now the laws have changed and there's much more equality for sexuality. I'm not saying it's perfect, there's still discrimination unfortunately, but the law is there to protect people, and people are much freer to talk about how they how their real attraction is. Population validity just refers to the sample. So the sample are the people within the investigation, and if the sample is not diverse, then you cannot really apply the findings beyond that population, which is why it's called population validity. So loads and loads and loads of studies, like the Loftus smash hit study, they've been done on students, particularly American white middle class, wealthy, well-educated students who are not representative of many people in America, let alone the rest of the world. So it's hard to generalize the findings to the rest of the population if the sample is limited and not diverse. And then mundane realism you learnt about in year 1. Mundane realism refers to the task that is being carried out in the investigation. So I put there about the Loftus's smash hit study, where people were watching videos of the car accidents. It's just very, very different seeing a car accident in the real world. So if the task is not true to life, if people are watching videos of violent crimes and then asked about their recall to test accuracy of eyewitness testimony, it's very different watching a video to actually seeing a crime committed. Or in memory, there's a lot of tasks that are very artificial, where people learn lists of words, and in everyday life we don't tend to learn lists of words. And so better tests of memory would be like, well, more realistic tests of memory might be if someone can remember a shopping list when they're in the supermarket, or if they were working as waiting staff, could they remember the order of the people on their table? That would be a real task in a real life setting, whereas learning a list of words in a laboratory setting is just very fake. So when we think about, I've said there, try and list as many as you can. And hopefully you're thinking of things like the electric shock experiment from Milgram. That's not something you do in everyday life. And like the 3-line test or the blue-green slide study from Minority Influence. Those tests are just very, very fake, and so it's hard to generalise the findings. So we're moving on to the assessment of validity. And first of all, we've got face validity, which is really obvious. It's the most obvious type of validity. And it's just by saying, on the face of it, are you really measuring what you intend to measure? So you look at your research tool and scrutinise it and check, is it really measuring what it's meant to measure? And it's often useful to ask other experts in the field, because they might have a more objective take on it. So if you were using a questionnaire to measure depression, you'd look at each of the questions and make sure they're clearly focused on depression, not other topics like anxiety or OCD. I've said to have a look at the Beck's Depression Inventory. You can just Google that. If you're one of my students, it's on the psychopathology unit on Teams, but it'd probably be quicker just to put Beck's Depression Inventory into Google. And when you look at all the questions there, for each kind of state, it gives you like 4 statements, and you have to like circle which one you agree with. And in the end, it will give you a quantitative score. But regarding face validity, it's looking at each of those questions and making sure that each question is fully focused on depression. If it was an experiment, you would look at the DV, the dependent variable, and think, on the face of it, does that actually measure what it's meant to? So that's face validity. The other one is concurrent validity, which is used usually for questionnaires, and it's where you get an existing questionnaire, one that's already established, and you get a participant to fill in that one. So for example, you get them to fill in the Beck's Depression Inventory, which is a well-established questionnaire to assess depression. And then you would get them to do a new questionnaire that's measuring depression. Then you get both, so it's the same person does the 2 different questionnaires, and then you compare their scores. And if their scores correlate by 0.8 or more, then that tells us it is a valid measure of what it is. So it's just the same person does an already established questionnaire, they do a new one, they correlate their answers, and if they correlate by 0.8, it is. Ways of improving the validity of a study. You could use a control group. So a control group is used to make comparisons to the IV. So in drugs trials, they will always have a control group. So they want to test the effectiveness, say, of a new antidepressant. And so they'll randomly allocate the participants to either receive the real new antidepressant, or the control group will get a placebo, and they won't know which one they've got. A placebo is a fake drug, I'm sure you know. And whenever you take a drug, it has an element of placebo. The very nature of taking a medication will have an effect on you. And so what we're looking at is, would the real drug have an effect? And so we've got something to compare it to. So control groups really help to establish the effectiveness of something. And remember, validity is like measuring, is something really doing what it's meant to do? So when you have a control group, you've got a comparison group to compare the IV to, or both conditions of the IV to. I think about minority influence in this one. So Moscovici's blue-green slide study, there were 2 Confederates and 4 naive participants, because they wanted to see whether the minority, the 2 Confederates, could influence the 4 naive participants to say that the slides were green, even though every slide was blue. And when the conditions of the IV were consistent minority, where the Confederates said green 100% of the time, or the inconsistent minority, where the Confederates said green 2/3 of the time. But they also had a control group where the Confederates just said the slides were blue. So the findings from the study showed that when the minority was consistent, then 8% of people agreed, or said that the slides were green. When they had the inconsistent minority, it was only 0.5% of participants who said the slides were green. And when they had the control group, only 0.1% said the slides were green. So there is very, very little difference here between the control group and the inconsistent minority. What that really shows us is, yes, we can see that the consistent minority was more successful, significantly more successful, but it also, that control group really emphasises that if you're not going to be consistent as a minority, you might as well not bother, because the findings were almost identical to the control group. When you compare the inconsistent minority to the control, there was virtually no difference. And so we've really learned something there, and that really helps the validity of a study to have a control group to make that comparison. Other ways of improving the validity are using double and single blind techniques or procedures. And so the single blind technique is where participants are not aware of the purposes or the aims of the experiment until afterwards. So it's called single blind because the investigators know what's going on, but the participants don't. And this is going to reduce demand characteristics, because if the participants are not aware of what's going on, then they're less likely to guess the purposes of the study, or if they don't know it, they're going to behave more naturally. So many experiments do involve that element of deception, and you can discuss the ethics on that another time. But when you do deceive people and don't tell them the true purpose, then it means their behaviour is going to be more natural. If they knew the purpose, then it would, in some situations, it would ruin the investigation. So obviously with Milgram's experiment, if people knew the shocks weren't real and what they were really being tested on, which was obedience to legitimate authority, it would just ruin the whole investigation. A double-blind procedure is very similar, except that both the participants and the investigators running the investigation are not aware of the purposes. And when I was younger, I was like, well, how can the investigators not know? And it wasn't that the designer of the investigation didn't know, it was that the people carrying it out didn't know. So they usually use research assistants or even an independent study in independent organisation, especially in terms of like drug trials. And so that means that in a drugs trial, both the participants don't know if they've got a real drug or a placebo, and the investigators who are running it don't know which participants have got the drug or the placebo. In other investigations that aren't involving drugs and placebos, it might be that the investigators are not aware of the purposes either. So this will control for both demand characteristics and investigator effects. So investigator effects, I'm sure you know, are where the investigators unwittingly, unknowingly give subtle cues and clues to particular participants that could influence the outcome of the results. And so therefore you're going to get invalid data. So both single blind and double blind procedures will control and help validity. You can also use something called a lie scale to improve the validity of a questionnaire. So when you've got a questionnaire, you will include things like filler questions, which are fake questions to hide the true purpose of the study, which helps validity. But you're also going to include some questions that measure whether people are giving socially desirable answers, meaning that they've lied. So if somebody kept coming up with answers that were socially desirable on the lie scale, like showing that they were high in lying, then you would just simply chuck their data in the bin, because it's no point using their data because it would be invalid. So what I want you to do is pause the video and read this rather long stimulus. And the question is, how would you assess the validity of this study? So pause the video, have a read, and then I will explain it. Okay, so hopefully you've read the whole thing and come to the conclusion that we're going to assess it through face validity, because on the specification, when it comes to assessment of validity, it only really mentions face and concurrent, and we know that concurrent validity is used on questionnaires. So face validity means that we look at this whole investigation and we look at whether, on the face of it, is it really measuring obedience to legitimate authority. And if you weren't sure, you could ask someone else in the field. But yes, it is. You would use face validity, and it does seem valid because it's saying, you know, in this particular example, they're using the power of uniform as a legitimate authority, badge of authority. And in this case, it's a high-vis jacket. So imagine if you really were in this situation. Imagine that you've gone to a car park, there's one space left, and someone in there, just regular clothing, says, no, you can't park there because I've reserved it. You'd be like, I don't care. And in you would go normally. But if someone in a high-vis jacket with a walkie-talkie, someone said the other day, said to you, you can't go in there, it's reserved for somebody, you're likely to think that that person is a legitimate authority figure because of the high-vis and the walkie-talkie, and so you're likely not to park there. So this, using face validity, on the face of it, is the DV, whether people, and the IV, when you're looking at these things, is it really measuring what it's meant to measure? And in this case it is, because counting the number of times that people park in the different conditions of the IV, like wearing the high vis or not, is going to show you whether people are obeying legitimate authority figures. Okay, so we're nearly there. Reliability now. Reliability, hopefully you've just reminded yourself that reliability itself means about getting consistent results. So if you repeated an experiment, would you get similar results the next time? There's also internal reliability, which means that the measure is consistent within itself, and external reliability talks about whether the measure is consistent over time. On spec, it talks about assessment of reliability. So there are two ways: test, retest, and inter-observer. So we'll look at test, retest first, and that is used usually on questionnaires. So you can see here we've got the same guy. He's completing the same questionnaire 1 week apart. So he does it on the 1st of January and the 8th of January. And he's completing the Beck's Depression Inventory, or the BDI. And so he's the same person, done the same questionnaire 1 week apart. And so he should get consistent results, because depression wouldn't disappear within a week. So if this guy is depressed, we would expect that he would get the same result or very similar 1 week apart. And so you would get his scores from both the questionnaires and use a Spearman's Row test to find out the correlation coefficient between those scores, which should be 0.8 or more to be reliable. And then the second type is inter-observer reliability, and my students, I know you've done this in the first year. So it's about comparing results or tallies from an observation. So it's inter-observer reliability is assessing reliability of an observation, and there are 3 steps to inter-observer reliability. Step 1, get 2 or more observers and agree behavioural categories. Step 2, independently observe the same situation and tally the observations. Step 3, the observers compare their results using a Spearman's row test, and if their tallies correlate by 0.8 or more, then they have inter-observer reliability. Just to note here that if you were doing a content analysis, it would be exactly the same really, but you just call it inter-rater reliability. To improve the reliability of questionnaires, you can, how would you test the reliability of a questionnaire? So you would test the reliability of a questionnaire through test retest, and if the results were not reliable, then to improve the reliability, you would simply change the questions. So it might be that the questions are ambiguous, or you might have put in a double-barreled question, which means asking 2 questions within one, and so somebody might agree with half of it, not the other half. So you would change all double-barreled questions to be single-barreled, just like one question, one answer. You might simplify them. You might even remove some questions, and that will help improve the reliability. It says there about improving the reliability of interviews. So you could do a structured interview instead of an unstructured. So as you know, a structured interview has got all the same questions, and so each person gets the same questions. An unstructured interview is way more fluid, where each question is formed from the answers from the previous question. So they tend to be very unreliable. If you wanted to improve the reliability, you would make the questions simpler, unambiguous, and you might choose a structured interview. To improve the reliability of experiments, any ideas? How would you make sure that you're measuring, that you would get reliable results, findings? So hopefully you've been thinking about the IV and the DV. So you would operationalize the IV and DV a bit more. You'd revisit them and make sure that they're very clear. And in terms of observations, you would operationalize the behavioural categories if your observation wasn't reliable. So you just go through the behavioural categories, make sure they're completely unambiguous, that they're very clear and specific, take any out that are not working, and that will improve the reliability. So there is if you want to fill out a summary poster, then it'll be in the research methods folder on Teams, RM61. But also, I think when you first came back, I gave you a research methods section from a specimen paper, and you did like most of the questions, but there was a couple that had validity on. So just go and have a look at that paper and do the validity questions. And then I've also got an old spec exam paper for you, which I'll give you when I see you in class. Any questions, then get in touch and I'll do what I can to help.